You already knew, watching her wipe her hands on the tea towel before touching the pan, that tonight was something she had made 1,000 times without a recipe card. That knowledge lived in her hands, not on paper. Here are 30 quick British suppers your nan made without a recipe that have vanished. Bread and dripping was the taste of arriving home. You pushed open the back door into the warmth, the smell of roasting fat still hanging in the air from Sunday, and she was already at the tin on the shelf behind the cooker. The old battered tin was never emptied, only replenished. She scraped down to the dark jelly at the base, spreading it thick across a cut of white bread without a word about quantity or method. During rationing, dripping was rationed at roughly 1 shilling and 2 pence per person per week, which made the careful saving of every drop that came from the roasting tin not a choice but a necessity that became, over years, simply the way things were done. The fat was white and solid on top. The jelly underneath held the concentrated flavor of every bone and joint that had sat above it, reduced and clarified by heat into something with a depth that no bought product replicated. Nobody makes it like that now, because nobody saves the tin, and the tins that held it, dented, greasy, impossibly familiar, have all been thrown away. Liver and bacon came to the table fast, which was the whole point of it, and also the whole danger of it. The liver, lamb's liver most often, sliced thin by the butcher and cooked the same day it was bought, went into a hot pan in a little dripping for no more than 1.5 minutes on each side, just enough to brown the outside while the center stayed pink and yielding. Overcook it by 1 minute and it turned grainy and bitter, and there was no recovering it. The bacon went in alongside, back rashers preferably, or a thick piece of streaky if that was what the budget allowed, and the whole thing came to the table with a spoonful of the pan juices, a mound of mashed potato, and nothing else that needed to be there. During the war years and into the 1950s, offal-like liver was not rationed, which made it a practical staple for households where protein was carefully managed. In northern working-class kitchens, it appeared on the table at least once a week. The secret was the heat and the timing, and knowing when to take it off the flame. Welsh rarebit carried a joke in its old name. It was originally called Welsh rabbit, a mockery implying that the Welsh were so poor, their rabbit was made of cheese. But the dish that emerged from that insult became one of the most carefully made things to come out of a British kitchen. A sauce built from mature cheddar, dark ale, a spoonful of English mustard, a splash of Worcestershire sauce, and a little flour to stabilize it, stirred over low heat until the cheese melted into something thick and glossy, then spooned over toast and grilled until it blistered and browned in patches. Getting the balance right, the sharpness of the cheese against the bitterness of the ale, the heat of the mustard, the saltiness of the Worcestershire, required attention and a sense of what the dish was meant to do. It was a light supper that somehow satisfied completely. In the Welsh valleys, it remained a working kitchen staple well into the 1970s. Today, it appears on gastropub menus as heritage comfort food, but the version made at home on a Friday night with leftover cheese and a bottle of stout was a different proposition entirely. Kedgeree arrived in British kitchens by way of the Indian subcontinent, where a dish called khichdi, rice cooked with lentils, spiced with cumin and ginger, had fed communities for centuries. British colonists encountered it, stripped out the lentils, added smoked haddock and hard-boiled eggs, and brought it home, where it was eaten as a breakfast dish through the Victorian and Edwardian eras. It then slid down the day to become a supper in the 1940s and the 1950s, when the morning meal had become too hurried to accommodate it. Long-grain rice was cooked in salted water until just tender, then drained and dried in the oven, before being combined with flaked smoked haddock, sliced egg, a generous knob of butter, and a careful hand with the curry powder. Not enough to announce itself, just enough to warm the back of the palate. The technique that separated a good kedgeree from a school dinner version was the final stage. You folded the fish through the rice gently, in one direction, with a light touch, so the flakes stayed whole rather than breaking into the rice and disappearing. But if kedgeree arrived with the ambitions of the empire behind it, faggots never needed any. They were the food of the South Wales valleys and the West Midlands, made from the parts of the pig that the butcher could not sell whole. The liver, the heart, the lungs and the cheek meat, minced together with onion and mixed herbs, bound with egg, shaped into balls and wrapped in caul fat, the lacy membrane from around the pig's stomach. That caul basted the faggot as it cooked and prevented it drying out. In the South Wales valleys during the 1920s and 30s, women in mining communities made faggots in batches of 100 at a time to sell from their kitchen windows on a Friday, a practice that supplemented household income and supplied the neighbourhood simultaneously. In the West Midlands, they were called savoury ducks. In both traditions, the gravy, dark and made from the cooking juices and stock with a little thickening, was as important as the faggots themselves, because you ate the whole thing together. The caul-wrapped meat was soft enough to cut with a fork, the gravy absorbed into the mashed potato alongside. Tripe and onions was the dish that separated those who had grown up with it from everyone who had not, and the separation was immediate and total. The smell hit you first, milky and faintly bovine, a smell that belonged entirely to this dish and no other. The tripe, available in 3 forms, smooth from the rumen, honeycomb from the reticulum, and the thicker, ridged seam tripe from the immersive, was sold pre-dressed and blanched from the tripe shop or the butcher. You simmered it with onion in milk, seasoning as it cooked until the tripe was tender enough to yield when pressed, then thickened the cooking liquid with a little flour and butter to make a white sauce that coated everything. Specialist tripe shops were common on high streets across northern England and parts of the Midlands through the 1950s and 60s. Bradford had several, as did Manchester, Leeds and Sheffield. They closed one by one through the 1970s as the generation that ate tripe by habit aged out of the market, and the next generation never acquired the taste. Peas pudding was ancient before rationing made it essential again. The nursery rhyme documents it as already old: peas pudding hot, peas pudding cold, 9 days in the pot, and the dish it described was exactly that practical. Dried split peas were soaked overnight and boiled in a cloth or basin alongside the ham or bacon joint they would share a pot with for 3 or 4 hours, then mashed with butter and salt into a dense, protein-rich paste that could be eaten hot from the pot or set cold and sliced. In the northeast of England, particularly in Tyneside and Wearside, it became so embedded in the food culture that pork butchers in Newcastle and Sunderland sold it ready-made by the scoop through the 20th century, often alongside the peas pudding sandwich, white bread, peas pudding, sliced cooked ham, and a smear of English mustard. It was 6pence a scoop in the 1950s. The butchers that sold it are almost all gone now, along with the counter-knowledge of how to make it. Pan haggity came from the mining communities of Northumberland. It is a dish of layered raw potato, onion and cheese, whatever hard cheese was available, though the original would have been a local variety. It was cooked in a single pan on the hob. Thin raw potatoes are sliced and laid in overlapping rows in the pan, with dripping or lard. A layer of sliced onion follows, then another layer of potato, with cheese pushed into the gaps and scattered across the top. The whole pan is covered and cooked over a low flame until the potatoes have softened through and the base has crisped against the fat. Then, at the very end, a moment under the grill to brown the cheese on top. In the Northumberland coalfield, cheese was the poor man's meat, the most affordable protein available when wages did not stretch to the butcher's counter. Pan Haggerty made it the center of a meal rather than an afterthought. Nobody wrote it down. You learned it by watching, and then you made it by feel. That feel was something only the people who had stood in those kitchens possessed. Corned beef hash was the Friday supper when the week's money had been counted and the careful tally had come up short. A tin of corned beef, opened with the butterfly key that always seemed to shear off at the crucial moment, was turned out onto the board and broken up with a fork, mixed with cold cooked potatoes diced small and a sharp-edged onion. Fried hard in whatever fat the pan held until the edges of the potato had caught and the whole surface of the mixture had developed a crust, then turned and crisped on the other side. The tin with its familiar key was a rationing-era fixture. Corned beef was imported and available when fresh meat was not always guaranteed, and by the 1950s the tin had become such a household standard that most kitchen drawers contained a butterfly key that had never been reunited with its tin. Served with brown sauce, or with pickled beetroot, or with nothing, it was eaten at a weeknight table that had no further ambitions for the evening. Sardines on toast was a supper that required no skill and no planning, which was precisely why it worked on the evenings when nothing else was available and nobody had the energy to want it to. A tin of sardines in tomato sauce, or in oil, but tomato was the British preference, opened with the key soldered to the base and was peeled back in that rolling way that always seemed to leave a jagged edge at exactly the wrong moment. The sardines were tipped out onto slices of toast made directly under the grill. The sauce from the tin was spread across the bread first, so it soaked in. In the 1960s and 70s, the ritual of the tin key was as familiar as the taste of the sardines themselves. Generations of kids knew the specific resistance of that metal strip and the smell of the sardines the moment the seal broke. You never plated them whole. You fork mashed them directly on the toast, breaking them down with the sauce until the mixture was spreadable, and you ate it quickly because it did not improve with waiting. And for all the quick suppers built from what was already in the cupboard, there was always Lancashire hot pot, one of the few British dishes to have its cultural weight confirmed in fiction before it was confirmed in a cookery book. Elizabeth Gaskell described it being made and eaten in North and South in 1854, with cheap cuts of lamb or mutton layered with sliced onion and potato in a tall brown pot, sealed with a final layer of thin sliced potato that would crust and brown during the long oven cooking. In its earliest form, the hot pot sometimes contained lamb kidneys and Morecambe Bay oysters, abundant and cheap enough in 19th century Lancashire to function as a stretching ingredient, adding depth to the gravy as they melted into the liquid. The hot pot went into the range oven in the morning and came out in the evening, 6 to 8 hours of slow heat that turned cheap, tough cuts into something yielding and dark and full of concentrated flavour. You learned the pot. You knew the pot's particular timing. The pot belongs to someone else now. Devilled kidneys were the savoury that sat at the end of the Victorian breakfast table, though by the 1940s they had migrated to the supper plate, where they made more sense as a quick meal for one or two than as part of a multi-course morning. Lamb's kidneys, the preferred cut, small and sweet enough to cook fast without toughening, had to be halved and trimmed of the white fatty core before anything else, a step most people skipped, and the reason most people who claimed not to like kidneys were judging them on the basis of a badly made version. The core, if left in, made the kidney bitter and rubbery. Without it, the kidney was mild and tender and absorbed the deviling sauce, dry mustard, Worcestershire sauce, cayenne, butter, and a little flour to bring it together into something that tasted sharply and specifically of itself. 2 minutes on each side in a very hot pan. No more. The timing was everything, and it was the thing nobody could teach you from a recipe. Pie, mash and liquor is a London invention, born in the docklands of the East End, and it worked on terms that mattered to people who worked with their hands. It was cheap, hot, and ready when you needed it. The pie was minced beef inside cold water pastry, suet on the bottom, short crust on top, served with plain mashed potato and doused in liquor, a vivid green parsley sauce made from the water in which eels had been stewed, thickened with flour and sharpened with malt vinegar. Joe Cook opened the first documented shop on Brick Lane in 1862, and within a generation, the format had spread across East and South London, each shop with its white tiled walls, marble-top tables, and sawdust on the floor to catch the eel bones. You ate with a fork and spoon, never a knife. In the 1940s, bombing devastated the East End. In the 1980s, gentrification did the rest. There are 34 shops left now. There were over 100 in 1895. Potted shrimps came from Morecambe Bay, where tiny brown shrimps were harvested in quantities large enough to turn them into an industry. The method, cooking them briefly in browned butter seasoned with nutmeg, mace, and a little cayenne, then packing them into small pots and sealing them under clarified butter, was a way of keeping them fresh before refrigeration existed in ordinary homes. Victorian tea rooms and seaside hotels served them on thin brown toast with a wedge of lemon as a light supper. The secret, which most people who dismissed them never knew, was temperature. You had to let the pot come to room temperature before serving, otherwise the butter stayed solid and you tasted nothing. Most people who tried them cold and decided they were not for them were simply wrong, because they never found out. Potted shrimps were the food of tea rooms and hotels, but bread pudding was what happened in kitchens where nothing was ever wasted. It started with the stale bread nobody had finished, heels of loaves, yesterday's slices, the odds and ends from the bread bin. You soaked them in milk until completely soft, squeezed out the excess, then mixed what remained with egg, a little sugar, dried fruit, mixed spice, and whatever fat was available, suet, margarine, or a scraping of butter. The mixture went into a greased tin and into a moderate oven for 40 minutes until the top was dark and the inside had set into something dense and slightly sticky. What had started as scraps came out as a substantial meal, eaten hot with custard or cold the next day in slabs. In the 1950s, recipe books still listed stale breadcrumbs as a standard ingredient. Today, supermarkets sell fresh breadcrumbs in bags. The thrift that made the original possible has been packaged into something that only looks like convenience. Bubble and squeak was named after the sounds it made, the bubble of moisture and the squeak of greens against hot fat. And in working households, it was Monday's supper made from Sunday's leftovers. Cold mashed potato and cooked cabbage or sprouts were pressed flat into a pan in which bacon fat had been heated until it shimmered, then left completely alone until the bottom crust had turned dark golden. The crucial thing, the thing you only knew if you had watched it done right, was that you never stirred it while it cooked. You pressed it down, walked away, and came back when the smell told you the base was ready. During the war years, bubble and squeak became more central to kitchen life, since wasting the previous day's vegetables simply wasn't done. Today, it appears on gastropub menus as a retro side dish. It used to be the main event. Paniculty, spelled in half a dozen ways depending on which part of County Durham you came from, was the dish that miners' wives left in the oven all day while their husbands were underground. The families of shipyard and colliery workers around Sunderland and Seaham developed it from Sunday's leftovers, layers of onion, corned beef or bacon scraps, sliced potato and root vegetables, barely covered in stock, set in a low oven at 7:30 in the morning and retrieved at 5. By then the potatoes had absorbed everything, the meat had softened into the broth, and the smell that hit you when you walked through the door was the smell of home. Nobody called it a recipe. When the pits closed in the 1980s, a lot of these kitchen habits closed with them. Gammon and egg was the supper that felt like a treat, even when the budget said otherwise. A thick rasher of gammon, properly cured, fatty at the edges, not the paper-thin supermarket slices of later years, grilled or fried until the fat crisped and the meat caught a little colour, served alongside a fried egg whose yolk you broke deliberately over the gammon so the richness ran across everything. In the 1960s and 70s, it became the dinner-out staple for families who did not often eat out. Practically every roadside cafe and working men's club had it on the menu, always with chips, always with a small pile of tinned peas, and always with the slightly incongruous garnish of a half tin of pineapple on the side that someone had decided was glamorous. The pineapple was a serious point of pride. Nobody questioned the pineapple. Glamorgan sausage contained no meat whatsoever, which made it almost unique among sausages, and entirely characteristic of the Welsh coalfield communities that made it. Glamorganshire cheese, sharp and crumbly and specific to the region, was mixed with leek, fresh breadcrumbs, a little mustard, and egg to bind, then shaped into cylinders, rolled in more breadcrumbs, and fried until golden. George Borrow described it in his 1862 account of a Welsh inn. That means it predates any period when people assume vegetarian food was invented. It was not vegetarian by design, but by economy. Cheese and leeks were what the Welsh valleys had in abundance when meat was not always available, and the result could stand on its own table without apology. In the valleys today, it is still occasionally made, but as a curiosity rather than a staple. From the frugal economy of the Welsh valleys to the kitchen that asked the most of you, steak and kidney pudding was a different kind of commitment, not the quick weeknight supper, but the slow Saturday afternoon project that filled the kitchen with steam for 3 hours and announced itself to the whole house from the moment the pot came to a boil. You lined a pudding basin with suet pastry, rolled thickly, not thinly because the pastry had to hold through the long steaming, filled it with diced beef and kidney tossed in seasoned flour with a little onion and stock, sealed the top, covered it tightly in greaseproof paper and a cloth, and lowered it into boiling water. The distinction the old cooks understood was this: a steak and kidney pudding is steamed, not baked. Baking produces a pie. Steaming produces something else entirely. The kidney mellows through the long heat, the gravy thickens to something almost gelatinous, and the suet pastry becomes soft and yielding rather than crisp. She always watched the water level. She never let it run dry. Deviled chicken livers were the alchemy that happened when you took something almost everyone dismissed, the liver from a bird, soft and not obviously promising, and applied heat and confidence in equal measure. The devil's sauce was what made the difference. Worcestershire sauce, dry English mustard, a pinch of cayenne and butter, combined in the hot pan after the livers had cooked, so the sauce reduced and coated every surface. You fried them fast and hot, 2 minutes at most on each side, so the outside caught colour while the inside stayed just pink and yielding. Overcook them by a minute, and they turned dry and tasted of nothing good. Served on thick slices of bread fried in the same fat, properly fried, not toasted, the whole thing came together in under 10 minutes and tasted far more deliberate than it was. It sat on supper tables from the Edwardian era through the 1960s, then quietly left the table, taking its understanding of heat and timing with it. Egg and chips was the supper that told the truth about where you were in the week. By Thursday evening, if the money had run thin and the fridge thinner, there was always an egg and there were almost always potatoes. The chips went into the fat first, proper fat, lard or dripping. That gave them a flavour modern cooking oils do not replicate. They were fried twice, once at lower heat to cook through, then again at higher heat to get the exterior golden and blistered. Then the egg was cracked into the same fat and basted with a spoon, so the white set without breaking the yolk, the edges crisping slightly. One fried egg on chips with salt and a splash of malt vinegar, eaten at the kitchen table on a Thursday night, was not a poor meal. Towards the end of the month, just before payday, a fried egg on a slice of toast would do instead. Nobody made a fuss about it. That was the point. Laverbread is not bread. It has never been bread. It is boiled seaweed, laver, harvested from the rocks along the Welsh coastline, simmered for 6 hours or more until it collapses into a dark paste with a briny mineral depth that has no equivalent in any other British food. Welsh coastal communities, particularly around Swansea and the Gower, had been gathering and preparing it for generations, and in Swansea Market it was sold by the tub well into the 20th century, ready to fry or eat cold. The traditional supper preparation was to mix the laverbread with oatmeal, shape it into small patties, and fry it alongside rashers of bacon and cockles, so the three flavours, smoky rasher, sweet briny cockle, and the deep iodine richness of the seaweed, combined into something that tasted entirely of the Welsh coast and nothing else on earth. It asked nothing of you except that you knew where to buy it and weren't frightened of something that looked nothing like the supper it became. Cullen skink came from the town of Cullen on the Moray Firth in Scotland, skink being an old Scots word adapted here to mean the thick smoky soup that fishing communities made from what was most available. Undyed smoked haddock, potatoes, and onions simmered together in milk until the fish fell apart, and the potato thickened the broth into something substantial enough to eat as a meal. The smoke from properly cold-smoked haddock, pale gold, not the dye orange of industrial processing, permeated every element, so that even the milk took on a faint savouriness. Nobody measured the potatoes. You added enough until it looked right, and if you had to explain what right looked like, you hadn't been standing in that kitchen long enough. She is gone now, and the particular sureness of her judgment, how much fish, how thick the broth, when to take it off, went with her. But the thing about all of it, the hot pots and the puddings and the soups that fed entire weeks, was that the deepest memory was never the grand dish. It was the bread and dripping after school, standing at the kitchen table while she scraped the tin, and the specific instruction that came every single time, get down to the jelly. Not the white fat, that was just fat, but the dark layer underneath, the concentrated residue of everything that had roasted above it all week, the accumulated bones and juices and herb fragments of a dozen Sunday joints going back years, maybe decades. She handed you the bread already spread and you stood there in your coat, school bag still on your shoulder, and ate it in about 4 bites while she put the kettle on. The kitchen smelled of it, warm animal richness, salt, the faint burnt note from the base of the tin that no other smell in the world resembles. Those kitchens are gone now. The people who stood in them are mostly gone. What remains is the memory of knowing exactly what to scrape for, and no tin left to scrape. The Works canteen was not a restaurant, and it did not pretend to be one. It was a long room with formica tables, and the smell of whatever was being served already in the air before you reached the door, shepherd's pie, or a boiled gammon with parsley sauce, or, on Fridays, a piece of white fish with chips and tinned peas. You queued with your tray. The woman behind the counter served you without asking, because she already knew. You sat with the men from the same shift, ate in about 15 minutes, and went back to work. Through the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s, Works canteens fed millions of British workers their main hot meal of the day, in many households the only guaranteed hot meal, the nutritional spine of the factory floor. When the manufacturing base collapsed in the early 1980s and the closures swept through the Midlands and the North, the canteens went dark alongside the floors they had served. Nobody holds a memorial for a canteen. But a generation of men ate the best hot dinner of their day in one, every single day, for 20 years. Scotch woodcock contained no woodcock, just as Welsh rarebit contained no rabbit. It was an anchovy butter spread thickly on hot toast, covered with a soft, barely set savoury custard of eggs and cream, finished briefly under the grill. The anchovy element was usually gentleman's relish, patum peperium, the intensely salty anchovy paste made to the same recipe since 1828, spread before the custard was poured, so the saltiness of the fish rose through the creaminess of the egg as the whole thing warmed. Ambrose Heath's 1934 book, Good Savouries, dedicated several pages to this kind of dish, the small, intensely seasoned mouthful that closed the Victorian and Edwardian meal. By the mid-20th century, the savoury course had vanished from all but the most traditional tables, and Scotch woodcock had gone with it. To make it now is to follow a recipe from a book most people have never heard of, for a course in a meal that no longer exists. Brawn was what happened at the end of the pig. After the chops, the rashers, and the roasting joints had been claimed, what remained was the head. You split it, soaked it overnight, then simmered it for 3 or 4 hours with onion, bay, peppercorns, and a splash of cider vinegar until the meat fell clean from the bone. Everything came off: the cheek meat, the tongue, the small pieces from around the jaw. They were shredded, returned to a reduced version of the cooking liquor, seasoned firmly with salt, white pepper, and sometimes a pinch of mace, pressed into a basin, and left overnight until it set into a firm, sliceable terrine. It was turned out cold onto a plate and eaten with malt vinegar and a slice of bread. What the pig offered, the kitchen accepted without sentiment and transformed into something sustaining and good. The table ate well from what everyone else had passed over. Almost nobody makes it at home now, and the knowledge of how to render an unpromising thing into something worth eating has faded with the generation that understood it was simply ordinary. Sunday night supper was never hot. Sunday dinner had been the main event: the roast, the potatoes, the gravy. By evening the kitchen was quiet, and the cold plate came out instead. A slice of whatever meat had been on the joint, set now in its own fat. Cold boiled potatoes, half a tomato, rounds of cucumber, round lettuce, the soft floppy kind that was the only lettuce in most shops until well into the 1980s. Heinz salad cream, that specific tangy, slightly sweet, very British condiment available since 1914, was spooned over everything or offered on the side depending on whose table you were at. The cold supper plate was eaten at the table, but it felt different from dinner, quieter, the end of Sunday, and the knowledge of Monday already there. That particular stillness, the cold plate, the salad cream, the nearly quiet house, is as specific and unrepeatable as anything ever made hot. The people who assembled it are gone. What they assembled with such quiet care has gone with them. These kitchens fed generations without a recipe card in sight. Like and subscribe if you grew up in one of them.